Hello, I'm Chris Godber, and it's Sunday evening. I'm gonna sleep soon, but I'm a bit bored, so I thought I'd do a video talking about, very pretentious, but I thought I'd do a video talking about some of the books I read in the last year or so, fiction and non-fiction, and basically just give a few thoughts. Oh, that door, like a ghost door, it's so annoying. Anyway, on each one, talk a bit about each one, and obviously I'm going to timestamp each one in the description, so you don't have to watch me ramble on for 30 minutes, 20 minutes about a bunch of books, not all of which you may be interested in. Because we reach the titles, some of them are philosophy books, some of them are science fiction, some of them are horror, some of them are novels, some are, like I said, philosophy, some are, one is actually a mixture of a biographical and history book, but I'm going to start with a completely random order. Mark Fisher, Capitalist Realism, which is a philosophical book written by the late Mark Fisher, unfortunately, rest in peace, also known for K-Punk, his K-Punk blog, and associated with Acceleration in Lakeland, but also like sort of, I think he was sort of the anyway, I'm alright, I haven't got that much energy, I don't know. Sorry, it's just like basically in this book, which I only read once, and it's not that fresh in my mind, he's talking about how capitalism has sort of asserted itself as the only realistic political economic system, and it explores what effects that has had on work, culture, education and mental health. And it's talking about, is it possible to try and imagine an alternative, sort of like a new left, if you will, from the ashes of the failed project, of course, which was the Soviet Union, and just basically a lot of essays exploring that. It's been a while since I read this, so it's just going to be a very general sort of overview of what I thought of it. But it had a certain pace to the style it was written, which I quite enjoyed. When I read it, like, I've actually bookmarked a few points here. Like, I've got this bookmark here, this bookmark there, which I think was just why I was bookmarking, because I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. So I've bookmarked a chapter which is called Marxist Supermanny, and it's easier to imagine the end of the world than capitalism, which I think is a Slavoj Zizek quote. I think he's talking about Nirvana and Cobain. Anyway, I can't really comment too much on it, but it is an interesting read. You get it on Zero Books, which is quite a good lefty sort of like counterculture publishing house. I think many people of any left-wing persuasion know it. It's worth catching, worth getting. It's $7.99, not too expensive. Let's get something completely different, because I've been reading quite a lot of variety of fiction. Like I said, of fiction. I'm trying to really, fiction and non-fiction, I'm trying to broaden my reading horizons, and I've been hearing a lot about this fella, Thomas Ligotti. So I picked up Songs of a Dead Dreamer in Grimscribe. Look at the cover, it's absolutely beautiful book, stunner of a cover actually, I really love it. It's a nice book, it's a Penguin, classic edition. Now this is a collection of short stories actually. So I think there's also an essay as well. There's also an essay on writing horror in general. This is my first introduction to Thomas Ligotti reading this. I've not actually finished it, I've just read about just under half the stories. So I think the first part, because it's two collections in one, Grimscribe and Songs of a Dead Dreamer. And yeah, these are really quite powerful, strange stories, but I really enjoyed them. I really enjoyed the way they're written, the way they're constructed, Some of them really freaked me out. Actually, there was one story I remember about. It's one of the first stories about a killer on the loose, and the way it ends is quite suspenseful. There's one story about a strange house which really stuck in my imagination. But yeah, just really well written, constructed short stories, which is what you expect, because Thomas Ligotti's still alive and it's a Penguin classic, so you expect something of quality when you're reading it. But yeah, very good short story writing in the horror vein. Horror is not actually something I've read for a long time. I think all the reasons I was wanted to read Thomas Ligotti and more horror is because I've been starting to write like sort of more Kafka-esque horror myself in my own writing, so just had to investigate someone who's one to consider contemporary master, right? A very much lesser known but actually pretty exciting writer, Garth Simmons, who's I know a bit from back in Manchester. This is collection Hole Punch, which is actually reviewed on this channel. It's quite a large book actually, it's like 500 pages I think. No, not 500, 400, just short of 500 I think. Actually yeah, just short of it, 300. So you've got illustrations, and it's like a bunch of very short stories. Sometimes they're even what you consider flash fiction, I guess. Like sometimes they're even just a page, sometimes 2 or 3, sometimes up to 5 or 6. So very short stories usually. Very hard to describe. I think for most people this is going to be like Marmite, this book, which is probably a good thing. They are sort of very ironic. There's a bit of irony in them anyway, or I wouldn't even call them ironic, that they are bizarre, often like alien life forms, but it's the way it's written is it's very experimental fiction, I suppose. I enjoyed it. I actually did blast through it quite fast. I'm working on reading his next book, which I think I've got a copy of here as well. So I think, I don't know, maybe I'd like I am reading his novel Men in My Life at the minute. So yeah, he's an interesting writer actually. There's some really good illustrations in the book as well. It's nicely bound and everything here. Yeah, anyway, just that's worth reading. Last year I was rereading this bad copy of the book Zarathustra, Fredreich Nietszche. So I started rereading this again, and I was going through it again. So I think this bookmark is from the last time I was rereading it, and I've got halfway through, or just thought this is an important part. Was that the part of the tarantulas? Obviously a very seminal piece of existentialist philosophy, really, or pre-existential, but basically one of the main texts that will have inspired, how do we overcome nihilism, or that belief in nothing, and become an Übermensch, as Nietzsche would have described it in his work. How do we become the great man of culture, the great woman of culture, whatever, the great person of culture? How do you overcome the values of whatever world you find yourself in to create something new, to be a self-created person, all that stuff. This is the main text, and it's quite hard to read actually. It's like a lot of it's parable. It's almost like a religious text, ironically enough. I think I mentioned that before. Which can make it sometimes very, it's poetically written. The prose is poetic. It's not like, it's not very literal. There's a lot of metaphor. There's a lot of parable. Nietzsche loves a parable, and but it does actually make it sometimes more interesting. So, but yeah, I don't want to mull over these books too much, but everybody who's into any modern philosophy knows this book, of course. And I'm afraid this is a shame, but it's actually great. Nice cover as well. Unfortunately, got damaged. I think I reread this last year as well. Society of the Spectacle, Guy Debord. A seminal text of Marxist analysis, basically, of culture and the effect that mass media was having on human beings, really. So the spectacle is, it's like basically it's the media saturated world that we live in. Essentially, is how I've always interpreted it. So it traps us. But basically, the mass media traps us in this cycle, which is a spectacle, really, and we're all parts of that spectacle. It's there's a lot going on there, and also, interestingly enough, D.G. Du Bois is also very critical of Marxist-Leninism under the Soviet Union, which is refreshing to see from a leftist of that period. He talks a lot about images. I thought it's, in a way, it's pre Baudrillard in a way, like simulacra and simulation. There is a certain prefiguring, if you will, for that in this writing. It's been a while since I probably really examined it, but yeah, it's if you are interested in media analysis or like leftism of that period, and arguably now as well, it's worth reading. Culture as well. Okay, so you got something a bit more classic. Chekov, Nervous Breakdown. So I've been wanting to explore more Russian classic lit. Like I read a bit of Dostoevsky a few years ago, and I want to get into, because I've been writing short stories a lot, I've been starting to check out Chekov. So I bought this book. It's really cheap actually. It's like £1, I think. Even it says £2, but it was £1. These little books are great actually. I really enjoyed the story of the Black Monk, which I think I've talked about a bit before on this channel, which is about a man who's like who thinks that he needs to basically almost make himself ill to become a man of genius. That's sort of and then he has this hallucination which he revisits him a few times, called the Black Monk, and I just found it very compelling. The first story is more of a story about which is called A Nervous Breakdown. The key story that's named after is about the ghost of the door again. It's about a guy who's like visiting a brothel. I found that less compelling, but the Black Monk is definitely a really interesting story. Obviously it's Chekov, so he's considered one of the greatest short story writers of the short story writing tradition, and it didn't disappoint. Black Monk actually moved me very much. Actually, I found it very emotionally compelling for some reason. I don't know why. Like, I just identified this figure in the story. I think I personally identified with the figure, not the Black Monk, but the actual key figure. The main character, whose name is, I can't remember, is Andrei Vasilyevich Kovin. So somehow I felt some sense of identification with that character. Anyway, it's brilliant, really written, very worth picking up. This is a borrow, Isaac Asimov, Currents of Space. This is actually a current book I'm reading. I'm just about halfway through. I'm going to probably read it tonight, I think, before I go to bed. It's a science fiction novel. I'm quite enjoying it now. Like, I was losing the pace about a quarter of the way through, but I've actually found it again. Just picked the pace up a bit. Basically, there's this space analyst, and he's had his memory wiped. He's holding some sort of secret in his brain that is very important to somebody. But he's had his memory wiped and been dumped on a planet, and then now he's getting involved in some political intrigue between a bunch of different factions. Most recently, he's been describing about the actual currents in space, which is about all the materials in space, which is quite poetically described. It's the first Isaac Asimov story that I've read, this first novel, so yeah, I'm quite enjoying it. Like, I see it as science fiction. I see it's fantasy science fiction, really. Like, even though I don't know if Isaac Asimov's like considered as hard sci-fi, but like it's not, for me. It's more like science fantasy in a good way. Not like it's not like Star Wars science fantasy, but I find it obviously like some of the way it's set and all the different people and everything. Just I think it's still science fantasy really, but I'm quite enjoying it, and it's well written. Like I said, it's easy, fairly easy pace. I've got another Nietszche here, but before that I'll go on to a book I revisited a lot actually during the last year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago now. Books and Cigarettes with George Orwell, which is essentially just a collection of essays. He talks about bookstores. It's more like lesser known essays really. So he talks about, there's one about bookstores, there's one about like social issues, talks about poverty. There's a very interesting essay he also does on how some leftists were sort of like just trying to justify Stalin and how I just found it disgusting, and sort of the prevention of literature. So there's an interesting essay about Soviet sort of suppression of culture, as it were, under Stalin, which is actually really interesting. That's actually really interesting essay. That was probably the most interesting essays that I read in this collection of essays. And it was very critical of Stalinism, as you'd expect from Orwell. 1984 is essentially his extreme version of what the Soviet Union was, as in satirical terms. Another Nietszche, but I've not finished this one. I did get most of the way through it, but I've not actually finished it. But for Tradegy, I think this is Nietzsche's first book, and again I was just like doing a whole final readings of Nietszche really that I wanted to do. I'm not really going to read any more Nietszche though, because I feel like I've got my fill, I had my fill of him. But then also I haven't. Nietzsche's annoying in that way. I feel like I want to read more of him, but even though he annoys me sometimes as well, like when he starts ranting on about some things, I'm just like, oh come on man. But then when he gets the interesting stuff, it's so much worth it. This is very much like a lot of him thinking about Greek culture. A lot of it relates back to Dionysus and that Apollyon thing that he's so obsessed with, which makes sense because I think he studied that. And this is his first book. So it's less revelatory, less radical, I suppose, than his later work. It is interesting, but I found it less compelling, I think. Like, obviously I find some parts of it compelling. I mean, the key idea of it is the idea of that we reveal truth through, drama, basically, enacted. So it talks about essentially this book's about the Apollyon and the Dionysian. So, one is chaos, Dionysian, and that's what creativity roots from in Nietzsche's view. And then there's the Apollyon, which is like order, beauty, sort of like structure, more logical sort of approach to the world. But these are like two archetypes in the Greek pantheon of gods, right? Or cults. But it's interesting enough. Not as compelling as his other work, though, to be honest. This is a really masterful book. This is the last one as well. I'll wrap this up after this. I might do a few more books like this, just randomly talking about a few books. This is really interesting. There's a lot of photos in it as well. So this is about... So I became obsessed with Shostakovich a few years ago. Actually about 4 years ago. Actually further back, 6 years ago, when I started listening to his music. And that obsession only grew. The more I listened to his music, the more I found out about his story. Because I have this... I lived in Russia for 2 years. I don't have an obsession with Russian culture, but I'm very interested in the dissident sort of branches of Russian culture, which if you actually look deep enough into it, most of the stuff that's really lasted is the dissident literature, dissident, not completely, and there are obviously like two sides to any culture, but and Shostakovich is quite an important musical part of this, and this is a story by M.T. Anderson, who actually wrote a story which I read when I was quite young, which was quite influential on me, called Feed. But this is a very different novel to that. This is obviously based on truth, and it's got Barrett's biography. So the start of it is like sort of biography of on Shostakovich and like how when he's growing up. It's got a lot of really beautiful photos as well on there. And it's talking about basically just his growing up. It's like cultural, like get himself established as a composer. But then it rapidly gets onto the war, the Second World War, and the defense of Leningrad, which is Leningrad siege. And it goes into a lot of grim detail about that event and how, also how Stalin sort of like really screwed it up. the defence of Russia at first. Like, I mean, there was a non-aggression pact actually between Germany and Russia for a while, and then Hitler backtracked on that and decided he was going to invade Russia, which was the biggest, which actually cost them the war ultimately, and unfortunately the lives of millions of Soviet men and women when he invaded. But you know, that was terrible. Yeah, they call it the Great Patriotic War in Russia, but they lost millions. But they did really win the war. To be honest, they'll turn the tide essentially. But yeah, it's just a beautiful book. It's like thick. It's like there's a lot of interesting details in here about, and also there's also like some beautiful little stories about people overcoming the worst odds that they were facing as well in Leningrad. There's a lot of grimness, but also there's a lot of hope within the stories too, which I really liked. So this is definitely worth picking up. Yeah, Symphony for the City of the Dead. And it's also about the Seventh, which is a fantastic piece of music, which they actually played against the Nazis when they were trying to. It was an amazing story in itself. So the Nazis were basically, Leningrad was under siege, and the musicians played the Seventh Symphony very loudly to intimidate the Nazis, which I think is amazing. Anyway, that'll do for now. Like I said, I'll timestamp each book. Obviously, I'm not going very much into detail into all of them. I just think, talk about a few books. Like, I just realised I've got so many books here, quite a few of which I've read. I may as well just try and talk about them to people on this channel. Next time I'll probably try and group them a bit more logically somehow. But yeah, if you find this interesting, or if you have any suggestions for even a way to group some potential books, or if you have any books you think I might be interested in, let me know. Yeah, peace out, like and subscribe. That's it.